well, if it starts impacting all these people, and we're talking millions and millions of people, and what are they going to do? Are they just going to let people freeze? Well, the argument is they can't allow that to happen. But it might not just be a question of can they pay their bills? It might be a question in the winter, do we even have the energy?
Well, hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you for Arcadia Economics in the Denver airport on my way up to the Silver Symposium, which I'll be at by the time that you're watching this on Tuesday. Although, glad to see so many people enjoyed hearing from London Paul of the Sirius report yesterday, where he talked a bit about some of the exchanges, the move away from Western infrastructure, especially in regards to gold and silver. And in the second half of our conversation, which you're about to hear now, he talks more about how some of the politics, the energy situation, and how this all plays out. So it was a really good call with Paul, and I think you're in for a treat. And with that said, here's part 2 of the conversation with London Paul. Curious of how you see this going, especially with Europe this winter, where there have been reports of them easing sanctions or looking for exemptions because, like you pointed out, you have that dynamic where it now is becoming a real problem. And are they going to let people freeze to death this winter, or what do you think this plays out going forward over the next couple months?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a problem already for industry, and corporations, big businesses suffering this. We've seen countless examples of big corporations even having to mothball operations, particularly in an industrial context. But when you see from a cost of living crisis perspective, people are already suffering because energy costs are spiked enormously. I mean, typically in Western nations, people are paying 2-3 times what they were 12 months ago. Obviously, food price inflation is a major problem. We're seeing it very clearly in the Netherlands of food price inflation. So the cost of everything goes up. So you have a cost of living crisis that's starting to hurt people in summer. It's only going to get worse in the winter. And the risk, of course, of further inflationary pressure and energy costs spiking even more. And there's certainly indications when there's a kind of belief that the UK inflation may officially reach 18% next year. Well, what does that mean in reality? Probably 28%. When there's an admission of that, that's saying this problem's not going to go away. So as we go through autumn and into winter, the question is, how much is this impact going to be on the average person? And there's already sort of big business and energy companies screaming at governments going, you're going to have to bail everyone out. You're going to have to somehow provide a subsidy. You're going to have to give families another, I don't know, a few £1,000s to pay their energy bills, because otherwise we risk, a societal backlash. Now, to what extent that happens remains to be seen. But a simple argument is, if people are cold and they're hungry and they're suffering a cost of living crisis, they're struggling to pay, for the essentials. Maybe they can't pay their mortgage anymore. Maybe they lose their job. Maybe their whole security in terms of their life just gets thrown out the window. And this happens on an enormous scale. And we're already seeing what you might term the lower income earners across Europe starting to suffer in serious ways from a cost of living crisis. This will spread through the middle classes, and that's a pretty substantial chunk. If you look at the Netherlands, that's basically an enormous chunk of the population that pretty much have a flat sort of structure. Well, if it starts impacting all these people, and we're talking millions and millions of people, then what are they going to do? Are they just going to let people freeze? Well, the argument is they can't allow that to happen. But it might not just be a question of can they pay their bills. It might be a question in the winter, do we even have the energy? Right. Are we going to have blackouts? Are we going to have long periods without energy switched on? Are they going to have to tell companies to mothball operations? Because in reality, the principle always is, when you have to have power cuts or blackouts, you always have to allow industry to be affected. The idea is we cannot allow people to suffer. Well, what happens if people lose their jobs and we have massive unemployment because of all this? And they can't pay their bills because they're unemployed. So there are all these factors playing out now. Obviously, we don't want to be too sensationalistic about it, but there are enormous problems rearing their head now, and that's likely to only get worse. And Europe's a great example, and include the UK, and it's going to affect the United States very obviously. So these are problems they're going to have to contain. So they can sit here and virtue signal that, you know, we're doing all this to protect Ukraine and democracy. And, you know, you're going to have to take a bit of a hit, but it's not going to be sustainable. And this winter could cause enormous problems for Western nations. So they may feel that politically they can't do a U-turn and say to Russia, we just need the energy. Okay, we're going to have to find a solution, because that's political suicide. But it might be political suicide if you start to impact millions of people, not just because of higher energy prices, food prices, and inflation, but you know, if they keep raising interest rates, what happens? People, you know, indebtedness will catch up on them. They're too leveraged. And the unfortunate thing is often in the middle class is the one that's the most leveraged. So if you take, and I'm not saying it will happen in the Netherlands, but the Netherlands is a great example of this flat structure where people are, you know, leveraged. Well, that could be a nation that suffers enormous problems because of the flat structure. And so the argument is, do governments then go, well, yeah, we're going to have to, we can't raise interest rates anymore. We're just going to have to, you know, do like we did with the pandemic and just print. Is it going to be 20 trillion, 50 trillion? I don't know. We don't, well, we're being a bit ridiculous with figures, but whatever it takes, to use a Draghi phrase, to prevent Armageddon effectively. But here's the problem with that. If you print all this money, you're just going to make the problem even worse. You might temporarily stop something, but what, you know, I'm not trying to say we end up with Weimar Germany happening per se, but what caused that? Just endless money printing. Well, we just have to resolve this problem. So you just keep printing more and more money, and if you get a crisis of confidence in the currency, then that's when hyperinflation happens. That's the big difference. It's a confidence event, and to suggest that can't happen. I'm not saying it will happen, but there's a risk of it given all the reasons we've just discussed. So therefore, yeah, this autumn and winter, it poses a serious threat to not just the economic financial structure, but also societally. It could cause enormous problems. And the question is, these politicians, what are they going to do then? Because if they incur the wrath of half the population or 3/4 or whatever it might be, they're in no position to deal with this, because again, we've just had financialization for getting on for 35 years or so, since the 80s, where we're actually having to deal with real problems now. Now we come back to the point, we can't print energy or commodities or food. You can't do these things if you don't have them. You can print all the money you like, but how are people going to buy energy that doesn't exist? Now, that's a bit of an exaggeration, perhaps, but these are the kind of situations that and the reality we're facing. And as yet, most people in the West are not seeing this. But the other thing is, most of these politicians and people just don't have any grasp on reality. They think, well, that's a problem that happens in Zimbabwe or somewhere else. It would never happen here. But there are certainly noises coming out of big business, trade and commerce, particularly if you look at Germany, who've been making very sort of loud noises about the fact that, look, we've got serious problems. We can't, you know, sustain operations. And let's look at fertilizer, for example. If you've got fertilizer plants that are having to shut because they can't handle the energy costs, well, then you're starting to affect crop production and yield. So you're not going to produce the food. Therefore, you've got more food shortages. You're going to get more and more price inflation in food. That's a simple but very kind of illustrative example of the problems we're experiencing. So, and you know, how sustainable is it for what's left of European industry to be razed to the ground effectively because of spiking energy prices? And will it come a point when someone turns around to the Russians and go, well, look, you know, we're never going to agree on this, but we're going to have to do something? And the question is, will Russia just say, sorry, we're not helping you anymore because you tried to destroy our economy, our financial system, you tried to wreck our nation, destabilize it, remove our president? Do you really, why do we want to help you? And this is something people in the West don't understand. They're just seeing it Well, look, Russia's, refusing to play ball over Nord Stream 1. They're using technicalities about gas turbines coming from Canada. Well, yes, that's true, but who caused this? The West. If the West decides to try and destroy a nation, why would they want to play ball? Hence, these are the unfriendly nations, and these are the friendly nations. And the friendly nations can have energy. They'll be helped because Russia's a major food, breadbasket effectively. They'll help them with food and energy, and we'll do everything to support you. But you in the West, why should we support you? You made a decision. You're going to have to, you've made your bed, so you're going to have to lie in it. These are all the factors that are coming into play. And to dismiss it as, well, this is a problem in Zimbabwe and not in the West, I think is being very naive. But is there a potential for a solution, at least to alleviate the major problem? Yes, but that would need a major political U-turn. And then people in nations are going to start going, hang on, so what was really going on? If you're going to make a U-turn like that with regards to Russia, is something entirely different going on with regards to Ukraine you're not telling us? And so therefore all these things are playing out, and it's difficult to quantify precisely what the outcome will be. But at the moment, the West doesn't really have any options other than committing political suicide. By not doing these policy decisions, they're committing political suicide. So ultimately, it's the situation that the destination will be the same. It's just the journey is going to be different, whether they realize they cannot continue with these policy decisions. And ultimately this includes the US, who will have to sit down, understand the world's changing, the entire fabric of economies, financial systems changing. And they're going to have a kind of Bretton Woods in inverted commas moment where they'll have to sit with the global south and behave like adults and go, okay, it's over. US hegemony's over, the world reserve currency, the dollar's over. Okay, how are we going to rectify this? And actually have the rest of the world trust the US, because the biggest mistake, and whoever ultimately made this statement and then whoever agreed to it, when they said, I know, let's sanction Russia's central bank and steal however many tens of billions or hundreds of billions of Russian forex reserves, whoever made that decision was the worst mistake in history, because the rest of the world went, hang on, you could do that to us. If you're prepared to go to those lengths, why are we going to trust you? So it was an absolutely ridiculous policy decision, and they're now paying the price for doing it. And this is why nation after nation in the global south or in the Middle East is just turning around to the United States going, we don't want to deal with you anymore, because we know you might sanction us. You could cut us off from SWIFT. You could seize our forex reserves. You could sanction our central bank. And unlike Russia, which was able to weather that, there's a lot of nations out there who couldn't cope with that. They would collapse in the blink of an eye. And the irony, of course, is not that it will ever happen, but if you did that, say, to the United States, it would collapse in 24 hours. And that's the position these nations are finding themselves in, and saying, we can't tolerate that. The trust's gone. We can't trust you anymore. Why should we? And we like this new alternative, which is about cooperation and agreeing to disagree, because there are some things we will never agree on, but who cares? We can work together in a positive way. And maybe in time we'll rectify the things we don't like about each other. And bear in mind, a lot of that's been caused by the West anyway. So let's find rapprochement. Let's start to behave like civilized adults. And who knows, we can craft a new world that will be very much more beneficial to us. And frankly, the West can just continue to do whatever it likes, because we don't care anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's the difficult part for a lot of people who are seeing this to watch, where it continues to be just a double down, dig your heels in response. And perhaps the last question for you today, Paul, is that between what you're describing with the energy and resource situation and the war, and then what you talked about earlier with the Federal Reserve and the various Western central banks and their dilemma of, all right, raise interest rates to try and fight inflation, yet that creates the problems. When you combine those two, obviously it's far from an ideal situation, and perhaps this is an unanswerable question to a degree, but 2 years, 5 years from now, what does this world look like? How
to whatever degree possible, how does this play out, and what are we looking at then?
No, it's a great question, and it's a perfectly reasonable one. Now, okay, let's not try and pin dates on things because that's difficult to quantify. It's always event driven rather than time driven. But
Right.
the aspirations for the multipolar world, because really we've got two worlds kind of coexisting: this rising multipolar world and the death of unipolarity. And really, in some senses, for the United States, the Ukraine war could be seen as the end of unipolarity in totality if Russia emerges as the victor. But let's not get bogged down in that specifically. So there's these two worlds coexisting. We understand perfectly well why unipolarity is failing. It's failing for a number of reasons. First, because the world's got tired of US foreign policy. They've got tired of being screwed over by Western institutions, the IMF, the World Bank. They're sick of being threatened and coerced to, you have to agree with us, otherwise we will overthrow your leader, or maybe we'll assassinate your leader, and therefore they don't want to engage with the United States the way they do. The other thing is we fully understand why the Western financial system is failing. It's self-explanatory. You cannot have a financial system based on endless recycling of debt, just endless printing of money, QE, zero interest rate policy. It's totally unsustainable. Never mind all the sort of derivatives and everything else that exists and the speculation and the manipulation of reality. It's totally unsustainable. This is very obvious. It ended in 2008. They kept convincing themselves they could keep going, and to some extent, they kept the financial system going because they believe that's the economy. They, in their deluded mindset, think, well, it's a trickle-down effect. You're going to create all this wealth, in inverted commas, in the financial system, which is nonsense, and it will end up somehow in the real economy, and everyone will spend all this money, and we'll all do okay out of it, and that's the future of our economy, not producing goods that create real value. So you turn a dollar into $1.20. You don't recycle debt, and where the dollar ends up worthless, where it's worth just you produce nothing of value. So that's another thing that's unsustainable. The other part from the West is it's completely unsustainable in terms of debt. We've reached debt saturation, whether it's the individual, whether it's businesses, whatever, whether it's governments, it's not sustainable. The other thing is we've reached consumption saturation in the West. I mean, how many new things can people afford to buy anymore? It's ludicrous. So we've reached saturation point. We've reached the end of the line. We like to pretend that this is sustainable, and it's not. The flip side is multipolarity, which says, yeah, we want to work together. You've got some resources we need, and we can manufacture goods, and we can sell it to the rest of the world. We could sell it to you. But, we can all win out of this. We can resolve ideological differences between ourselves. Saudi Arabia and Iran is a classic example of this. This was all created by the West, particularly the United States, and we might be weeks off them having full-blown kind of diplomatic status again. This is the big change. There's a big change in attitude, and it's, we want an alternative financial system. We want something where we have sound money, where we're able to back currencies so they actually have, value, that people want to trade in other currencies with us. So, because we're not going to do what the United States does and have endless sanctions and wars and regime change and building military bases all over the world. We don't want that anymore. We want an alternative. And we think we can all work together and cooperate and grow economies. Now, the big difference is, and this includes China, they have the scope to build their economies and strengthen them. They haven't reached saturation point. And this is where I come back. If the West wants to be competitive, it has to pay Chinese wages. Well, we all know if you pay Chinese wages, the West collapses. It's completely unsustainable because of how our economies work, our financial system works. We can't do that, but that's what we have to go back to, which means we're going to have to use that term, reset everything. we're not in a position at the moment to even contemplate what that means, or we don't want to because we want to believe that our models is sustainable and it will last forever. But the global south has the opportunity. They have vertical growth markets. They have the capability to address the problem. They can walk away from all the Western financial debt they've got. They can walk away from the IMF, the World Bank, etc., and say, we're not entertaining, we're not working with you anymore, because every time we do, we end up losing as a result of this. We create more austerity. There's always the risk of, as we say, coups, color revolutions, etc. Well, there's an alternative, and we think now, and we're emboldened to believe we can survive that. I mean, Venezuela is a great example of that, with Russian and Chinese support. Maduro's still the president. Whether you agree with that or not isn't the point. He is, and he survived because of this. We've seen coups prevented in like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, the list goes on, and obviously places like Nicaragua, Cuba, there's been endless attempts, and they're failing because the world's adopting a different attitude from the global south perspective. So there's this whole new idea, and the question is, the West is capitulating. It can't fix its financial system, its economies. You cannot fix something that's irreparably broken. So it's just a slow grind to wherever we end up, until perhaps Western nations go, okay, it is over. We need a Bretton Woods, whatever that means. And we're going to have to accept the world's a very different place. But if we're the United States and we want to redevelop our economy so we have manufacturing and we can do this, how do we do this? What do we need to do to make that happen? What is the ramification? Who do we need support off globally to make this happen? The idea they can do it themselves is nonsense. It's impossible. So these are these big decisions that need to be made. But the question is, at what point does the West fold to the point that the financial system just goes? Now, there's a lot of reason to believe this could happen imminently. It's been imminent for a while, but does it mean it happens imminently? Well, that's a completely different question, because they'll keep printing money. But we've seen what printing money during the pandemic does. So this is just not refixing a problem. It's just delaying your date with destiny. So the question is, how quickly does the multipolar world develop? And we're seeing endless developments in a financial sense, in economies, in societies, and that sort of geopolitical engagement and rapprochement. So, but it's an ongoing process. But they realize the West's on borrowed time, and there's going to be some fallout, clearly, if the West fell over tomorrow, for argument's sake. And we're not suggesting that's the case, but we're illustrating a point that the West is on this collision course. The West can't fix anything. It could have made some restitution in 2008 if it made the right decision, but it didn't. I mean, it could have just said, okay, it's over there. And if they'd made the right decisions by now, we'd have been talking about a multipolar world with the United States starting to make some significant recovery and being a respected member of the international community, instead of being derided by huge swathes of the world because of its policy decisions. But of course, we're not there, and it's a very different world now than could have been. So they're the two worlds that are sort of coexisting, but one is in the ascendancy and the other is in terminal decline. And it's just a question, at what point does the one in terminal decline hold the white flag up and admit it's over, and we have to accept that things are never going to be the same again? But okay, how do we begin to make the necessary changes? Because the US can't, this idea, we'll just reshore all our production and we'll just become this great manufacturing base. Well, what, paying US wages? So everyone in the United States will have to pay 5 whatever times more for everything that's produced domestically, and which means they need to earn more money. Earn more money how? Doing what? That just creates more and more inflation. It's not sustainable, and it's not about what you earn. It's, you know, what's the purchasing power of your currency? I mean, can you have a sustainable currency that means, you know, you can go back to the point where you don't have people working 2-3 jobs to try and just stop, you know, the wolf from the door, so to speak. Right? what needs to be done. These are important considerations, but the people believe, and you can wave this magic wand and the United States brings all its industry home. The industry is not going to come home because A, there's not the infrastructure to support it. So who's going to finance this? The US is going to print trillions of dollars to rebuild America, and that's not going to have any ramifications for the dollar. Of course, it's this simplistic thinking that the US can do all this. It can, but it's going to have to make enormous compromises to its behavior and attitude. And that at the moment seems light years away, but things can change very rapidly. And we have to hope that's what happens, because the world needs a stable, trustworthy United States. It would be very good for the US, obviously, but good for the rest of the world. But in order to achieve that, they're going to have to make monumental changes for the rest of the world. And at the moment, the US will not consider it because it's the zero-sum game. It's like, you're with us or against us. If you're against us, we're going to destroy you. Well, they can't destroy nations. They can try and they failed to destroy Russia. They won't destroy China. And therefore, they have to reach a situation where they understand that that kind of attitude is just belongs in the Stone Age. It's not something that's applicable anymore. And maybe in 10, 20 years, the US can be a vibrant nation again with a strong economy, a real, genuine financial system, and a nation that the world's going, yeah, we can trust you now. And the world would like to see that, but we're not there. And that's part of the reason why trust in the world towards the United States and its allies is rapidly diminishing, because their attitude is, we can't trust you. I mean, people in the West can believe whatever they want with regards to the Ukraine war, but there are some irrefutable facts. And the rest of the world's going, well, you can all believe what you're being told about certain things, but it's just nonsense. And they look at the West and go, well, if that's your attitude, then we don't want to work with you. We don't trust you. You're going to have to start accepting that the policy decisions we make in the West are completely flawed. And that doesn't mean you support Russia's war with the Ukraine. It's just a simple matter of fact. This is reality, and we have to accept the reality of what's unfolding now. The war could change next month, next week. But as things stand, whether the West likes to argue or not, Russia's winning the war. From the start of the war, Russia controls a whole swathe of land. That's winning. It might not be because the West likes to make out it's losing because it was going to take Kiev in 3 days. Russia never said that. That's just the West believing that's what Russia was going to do. They're constantly believing Russia's failing because it's not doing what the West thinks it should be doing. That's irrelevant. And whilst the West wants to believe this, and that's fine, the rest of the world's looking at the West going, seriously, what reality are you living in? This is not how it's playing out. This is not the real world, and this is causing enormous problems. So it's great for the West to continue to believe what it wants to believe. The one thing that needs to happen is the war has to end today, because the longer it goes on, it weakens Ukraine's position, because the likelihood is Russia will control more and more of the territory, and it's not going to give it back. It will drive a far harder bargaining position when the war eventually has to end. This is not good for the West. And therefore, the war has to end. And that doesn't mean it ends and it's all, well, Russia's won and we've lost. It's not about winning and losing. It's about finding a solution that means Ukraine isn't just turning into cannon fodder for a war that, the longer it goes on, it does absolutely nothing but cause more and more problems for the Ukrainian people. And ultimately, that's what we should be focusing on. How is this damaging the Ukrainian people? And it's doing so enormously. And you can't fix that nation. It's broken forever. Whatever we think, the idea that, well, certain nation, the Crimea can be part of Ukraine again, it's impossible. Things are so badly broken, you will never unite the country again. So this is just, sadly, political reality. So what do we do to remedy these problems? And because the sooner the war's over, the sooner the intelligent Western heads realize that the need for the war to end has to be now. And there has to be an amicable solution, right? And we have to start to resolve the problems. If we don't, then the nations with access to cheap food and plentiful supplies of food are the ones that will thrive in the future. At the moment, the West is hanging very precariously on just those 2 points alone. And it's the age-old thing: if you can't feed your people and you can't heat and light homes in the winter, it doesn't bode well for the future of Western nations. And to what degree this unfolds, we'll see as the winter progresses. But it is a pretty bleak picture that we're looking at, and we have to accept that's the reality. So if people want the war to continue, well, just expect things to get progressively worse for yourselves. So who do you want to look after? Are you more concerned about yourselves and your own nation, or do you want the war to continue, which is that Ukraine at the moment is never going to win, and yet you'll suffer more and more consequences? I think in the West we've reached the point we need to look at it and say, what's more important, ourselves or what's going on in Ukraine? Because it's all well and good being highly principled about things, but if you suffer enormous consequences yourself, and frankly, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's just a tragic situation on a whole variety of levels, and I think you point out the key though is when can everyone accept what is reality and look for the best solution out there, which I guess a lot of it's not ideal, but you just pray and hope for that sooner than later. And Paul, although as much as is possible of making sense out of all this and laying out the options, you did quite a beautiful job of putting things in perspective. Before we wrap up, could you just let folks know where they can find your podcast and perhaps find you on Twitter, where I know you're pretty active as well, so they can stay up to date, because you have a great handle on the things that are going on here. And I think that's good for people to be aware of what you're doing out there.
Well, that's very kind of you to say, Chris. Well, obviously, Twitter's kind of just a small point. It took the Ukraine war for us to go from 8,000 followers. I think we're now nearly at 89,000. It's kind of bizarre that it's happened the way it is. But yeah, we're very active on Twitter, and we're just trying to be objective. I know people sometimes think I'm pro something. I'm not. This is just how the world's unfolding. And I made the point the other day on Twitter that I warned Western governments about what was going to happen. I said, you're going to have to accept the world's going to be very different. You're going to have to reach some kind of agreement with the Chinese and the Russians. You can't just have zero-sum game mentality. So it's always about trying to be objective. I know sometimes people get very angry, but this is reality, and we have to deal with reality whether we like it or we don't. In terms of the podcast, yeah, we're now over 1,500 episodes, and this is just something. Obviously, we do 5 a week, or sometimes 3 because we amalgamate depending on the subject matter. But it's roughly 5 times 20 minutes. It's very detailed. It's very compact. There's no waffling, and we cover geopolitical things, finance, economics, and just laying out how the world's unfolding. And you can subscribe for a year, where you get a reduction of a month, it's been $4.75 since we started it 6 years ago, nearly. It's very cheap for a reason. It's not cheap because we put out rubbish. It's cheap because it should be affordable. And we have had people approaching us to try and take it private, and we'll pay you stupid money to take it private. We don't want you to put this in the public domain, and we've refused to do it because we think it should be. And the reason we charge for it is because we can't earn money any other way, and we put a lot of effort in. And I wouldn't expect anyone else to work for nothing, and therefore I'm not prepared to work for nothing either. So, and I don't think that's an unreasonable position to take. And we do keep it very affordable. And obviously, you subscribe, Chris, so and what we discuss and on a kind of weekly basis, and we think it adds value because it gives people the reality of what's going on. And I want the West to succeed. I want the West to prosper. I want the West to be a vibrant economy, a vibrant society. But the idea it can continue doing what it's doing and achieve those objectives is not possible. So we need to change, and we need to change rapidly. And that's going to be painful. I mean, it's just an inevitability. But the sooner we start to do that, the better. And we should have done it in 2008. We didn't. In fact, we should have done it before then. But we can't change history. But that's the purpose, to say We're laying out what the multipolar world's going to do, how it's going to unfold, and then sadly, in the same breath, we're going to highlight the demise of unipolarity, which we've done so for 6 years, and I don't think it's unreasonable to say with a high degree of accuracy. And at the end of the day, it's about being accurate. It's about saying what's going to happen. And I could have taken a totally different angle and made it look like I'm just going to present some distorted version of reality. But sadly, it's about trying to be accurate. And being accurate doesn't always make you say the most popular things, but maybe one day, and sooner rather than later, we can talk positively about the West and what the United States can do. Because I think if the US gets its act together, it could be an enormously beneficial nation to the world. And I hope we see that happen yesterday or tomorrow, because it goes without saying, and even I really near China and Russia would like a strong nation amongst equals being the United States that's trustworthy, because they know it's beneficial. And let's hope that happens, and not just the US, but the Europe and the United Kingdom, because that would be a major game changer, and we could start to really accelerate a lot of developments that need to be put in place.
Yeah, you certainly just can hope for that for the benefit of everyone in the world. Not the easiest time out there. Although, Paul, again, I appreciate everything you share. Your podcasts are incredible. The level of knowledge you have about this situation, and also appreciate that you make it accessible for people. And again, they can find that at the Sirius Report. You can find you on Twitter at the Sirius Report. And really appreciate you joining me again. Been too long since we did this the last time, but thank you so much for everything you shared here today. And hopefully one of these days soon, we'll move a little bit closer to acceptance of what is and looking for some sort of solution to minimize the things that are going on out there. But appreciate everything you're doing, Paul, and we'll look forward to catching up again soon.
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure as ever to catch up.
All right. Well, you take care, and we'll talk soon, my friend.
Yes, and you.
Well, thank you, Paul, for all of the incredible information you shared there. Certainly a complex situation, not ideal in many ways, but I thought of all the people that have had on the show recently, quite a description that Paul gave, an insight of how these things are coming together, how they're laid out, and grateful to everything he shared there. Hopefully you enjoyed that at home. I appreciate you being here as well. And before we wrap up, I'd just like to say thank you to Sierra Madre, who brought us today's episode. Sierra Madre still closing their deal with First Majestic Silver on the La Guitarra silver and gold mine, along with their Tepic and La Tigra projects in the same region of Mexico where they've been drilling and finding good results, and on pace to meet their goal of 50 to 100 million of ounces going into production in the next couple of years. And you can find out more about that by going to sierramadregoldandsilver.com, or just click on the link in the description field below. Appreciate what they're doing, searching for gold and silver out there and bringing it to the world, and also for supporting the show in today's episode. So thank you to Sierra Madre, as well as London Paul and everyone watching at home. And I'll look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.